Richard Milhouse Nixon, born on January 9, 1913 in Yorba Linda, California, second of five children born to Frank Nixon and Hannah Milhouse Nixon. As the son of a service station owner and grocer, he lived a hard childhood with a small lemon farm in California. They were rather poor, and he was affected greatly when he experienced the heavy loss of two of his brothers early in his life. His younger brother died in 1952 from an illness, and he lost his older brother from tuberculosis. Nixon attended Whittier High School, where he ran for student body president, but lost to a more popular student. After graduating second in his class, he was offered a scholarship to Harvard, but his family couldn't afford it, so instead he attended the local Whittier College. Graduating from Whittier in 1934, he received a full scholarship to Duke University, where he studied law. After graduating, he returned to Whittier, where he met his future wife, Thelma. Thelma Catherine Ryan, in a local play. They married in 1940 and later had two daughters, Tricia and Julie. In 1942, Nixon and Pat moved to Washington, D.C., and he began work in Roosevelt's Office of Price Administration, but later left to join the United States Navy. He never saw combat, but returned with 2 service stars and several commendations. When he returned, he was encouraged to run for Congress and run against Democrat Jerry Voorhis. In 1946, seated in the House of Representatives, Nixon was on the Committee for Foreign Aid, where he gained his reputation as an internationalist in foreign policy. He was also recognized as a major anti-communist in the case against Alger Hiss, who was giving information to the Soviet Union. In 1952, Nixon drew the attention of Eisenhower and the Republican Party and wins the vice presidency in the Eisenhower administration. 2 months before the election, it was revealed that Nixon had a slush fund from campaign supporters, and many called for him to be removed from the ticket. To clear his name, Nixon delivered a speech that later became known as the Checker speech, as he said the only political gift he had accepted was a cocker spaniel that his daughter named Checkers. He turned the accusations back on the opposition, saying that unlike Democrat politicians' wives, his wife Pat did not have a fur coat but a respectable Republican cloth coat. During the Eisenhower presidency, Nixon expanded his powers as vice president as President Eisenhower suffered several illnesses, and this prompted the 25th Amendment, which provided the terms of the vice president if the president becomes disabled. In early 1960, Nixon began his bid for presidency and had little competition from the Republicans, but his Democrat opponent was John F. Kennedy, who would eventually win the election. After this loss, Nixon and his family went back to California, and he eventually decided to run for governor of California against Democrat Pat Brown in 1962, but lost the election. After this loss, his family headed back to New York, where he eventually decided to re-enter politics and run for president in 1968 against Hubert Humphrey and George Wallace with running mate Spiro Agnew, which he eventually won by presenting a calm against the storm persona and a hopeful end to the Vietnam War. Regarding domestic policy as president, Nixon was successful at increasing the amount of desegregated schools in the South and including more women into his administration. Nixon also supported the Clean Air Act in 1970 and supported his federalism principles of less government and fiscal responsibility. Nixon often returned to confrontation instead of compromise and would later get into trouble for it in the Watergate scandal. Wait, we're not there yet. Nixon's presidency was dominated by foreign policy as he dealt with Vietnam and the Cold War. He negotiated the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. He re-established American influence in the Middle East and began ping-pong diplomacy with China by reducing trade restrictions and sending the American ping-pong team to go play in China and eventually going to visit China himself. His biggest issue was Vietnam, where he began Nixon Doctrine, also known as Vietnamization, and withdrew American troops from Vietnam, but continuing air raids in Cambodia and Laos, which were both neutral at the time. This caused massive protest among young students across the country, shutting down many schools and universities. When Nixon's second election took place, he won by a landslide. The controversy ran rampant, as it was revealed that the Republicans running Nixon's re-election campaign may have had part in the break-in at the Democratic National Election Headquarters. As investigations began, many White House aides resigned, and Nixon continued to claim his innocence, leading to his famous televised White House speech in which he stated, "I am not a crook," which he obviously was. He claimed executive privilege and refused to release recordings that revealed Nixon and his aides discussing the break-in and disrupting the FBI investigation. Impeachment hearings were opened by Congress. Nixon was charged with obstruction of justice by the House committee and facing possible post-impeachment conviction. Nixon decided to resign the presidency on August 9, 1974. He appointed Vice President Gerald Ford as president, who pardoned Nixon on September 8, 1974. Richard Nixon retired to San Clemente, California, and later died of a massive stroke in New York City and was buried in his hometown of Yorba Linda, California.